Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those that have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners. And I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. Y'all, I'm in LA right now and I am just so happy. I love being in this city. It's so beautiful. The food is so good. The people are kind of nice. To a certain extent. And it's just so beautiful. It gives me the best vibes and the best feelings. Coming here for spring break was the best decision I could have made because I just love it here so much. I cannot wait to be here next year. I literally cried when I got off the plane. And honestly, I was crying a little bit before I started recording this because today's my last day and I don't want to leave. My Airbnb is perfect. Literally, it's so cute. The woman who owns this house made me cookies last night. I really don't even like cookies like that, but I just thought it was so sweet. And it's just such a beautiful day outside. You could hear the birds. Well, probably not y'all because Trey probably edited that out. But it's so beautiful. And I just feel so happy to be in this incredible city. Anyways, if y'all need recommendations, I'll give y'all them whenever y'all come here. Well, maybe not the expensive ones because, whoo child, I spent a lot of money that I shouldn't have. But oh well, it was worth it. Anyways, let's get into these current events. It's Women's History Month. Women's History Month began in the early 80s when Congress was petitioned by the National Women's History Project to extend the week-long event into an entire month. On March 8th, International Women's Day is celebrated by many countries across the globe after the United Nations adopted the day as an official holiday after many socialist parties across the globe began the celebration beforehand. The theme for this year's celebration was Balance for Better, an initiative aiming at promoting the idea that a gender-equal world makes the world function better because the imbalance we have in society now is felt by each and every human being to some capacity. As we're continuing seeing more grassroots activism that's spreading on a global spectrum, the expectation for balance is growing increasingly. The Balance for Better campaign doesn't just stop with the celebration of International Women's Day. It's a year-long initiative that will be a driving force for collective action aimed at creating balance in business, economics, sports coverage, media, wealth, and so much more. Gender balance is vital for different communities to not only survive, but thrive as well. While the day allotted as International Women's Day is significant and should be highlighted, it's important to recognize that we shouldn't just celebrate women and our accomplishments one day out of the year, but we should make it a continual thing. As women across the world are breaking the glass ceilings day in and day out, we need to be fully aware that championing women should be at the forefront of our activism. Women have historically been the catalyst for change in terms of social movements across time. We have rarely been ones to sit back and allow discomfort, injustice, inequity, and disproportionality stop us from getting shit done. For me, I've grown up with women at the center of my world, and the reason I was propelled to all of the opportunities I've gotten to be a part of. My mom raised me, along with my 3 other siblings, in abject poverty. She never failed at supporting me in all of the endeavors I was in, from early childhood to my adult career now. All while raising and supporting 4 kids, my mom obtained 2 master's degrees and is working on her 3rd currently. She also has her PhD, so go Michelle. Supporting women in all we do should be a norm, and creating balance in our world is not something that should be secondary, but the first thing we should be aiming to do.
Do you think that Ilhan Omar understands why her comments were problematic, and what happens if this happens again?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. I don't think that that the Congresswoman is perhaps appreciate the full weight of how it was heard by other people, although I don't believe it was intended in any anti-Semitic way. But the fact is, if that's how it was interpreted, we have to remove all doubt, as we have done over and over again. We're working now on a resolution. We'll see when we bring it to the floor. It was important for me to speak to the member first before we would proceed. She was in Africa. After I spoke to her, members had different tacks they wanted to take, some their individual statements, some thinking we should have a resolution. I thought the resolution should be enlarge the issue to anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia, etc., anti-white supremacist, and that it should not mention her name, and that's what we're working on, something that is one resolution addressing these forms of hatred, not mentioning her name, because it's not about her. It's about these forms of hatred, these isms.
She hasn't apologized. Does she need to apologize?
Well, she may need to explain that she did not. It's up to her to explain, but I do not believe that she understood the full weight of the words. I feel confident that her words were not based on any anti-Semitic attitude, but that she didn't have a full appreciation of how they landed on other people, where these words have a history and a cultural impact that may have been unknown to her.
In other news, the House recently passed a resolution that broadly condemns hate and intolerance that includes anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim discrimination. This resolution came in the midst of the political heat Ilhan Omar was facing for a controversial tweet that some took as her invoking Jewish stereotypes and as anti-Semitic. Omar apologized for her comments and clarified that her criticism was of Israel and not the Jewish community. She hasn't backed down in the midst of this and released a very telling statement of, "I am told every day that I am anti-American if I am not pro-Israel. I find that to be problematic, and I'm not alone. I just happen to be willing to speak up on it and open myself up to the attacks." I wholeheartedly agree with her on this because this isn't the first time we've seen comments on Israel misconstrued and people having to suffer from it, i.e. when Mark Lamont Hill was fired from CNN after he proclaimed the need for Palestinians to be free. I'm also not saying that the Jewish community does not have a right to take offense to her comments, because I do think that stereotypes concerning different communities are harmful and regressive. Yet, heavily criticizing a country that has long abused its inhabitants, all while the U.S. has a very huge economic interest in that country, is very telling on our end on who we believe is worthy of liberation and who isn't. Calling out Israel for human rights abuses is not anti-Semitic, because Israel is a country just like every other country on this planet and should be open to the same form of discretion. Human rights abuses are not acceptable, ever. And the whole point of governance is to hear diverse voices and opinions and not the same blanket acceptance of Israeli dominance over the Palestinians. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Israel-Palestine issue, don't worry, you're going to get your episode on it. Plus, all of these people in the government realm calling out Omar to be removed from House committees can have several seats, because I don't see these people calling for the removal of our racist, sexist, xenophobic, incompetent president or vice president. All of them. I have not seen the calling out for the removal of them, so they can just sit down.
One thing's clear about sexuality. There's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Female or male, gay or straight, pink or blue. We were taught to see these as binary. Now we're realizing it's more like a kaleidoscope. And this stuff isn't just for adults. Parents know this already. Kids explore gender, expression, attraction before they've ever heard of a spectrum. Take sex. We used to think it was pretty straightforward. X and a Y chromosome for males, 2 X's for females. But we see more combinations than that in real life. And even for people with just 2 sex chromosomes, hormones can vary wildly. So can anatomy. What makes someone male or female isn't so clear-cut. How about attraction? Some people argue the natural thing is to only be attracted to the opposite sex. But in practice, it ain't so simple, kids. Some people are gay, some are bi, some are asexual, and some will take whatever they can get. You know what I mean? It's another sexy sliding scale. When you throw in gender, it gets even more colorful. By 3 or 4, most kids identify with a gender, and it doesn't always match the sex they were assigned at birth. And a person's gender identity may change over their lifetime. And culture is getting us new ways to express all of this. How you dress, how you act and talk, how you present yourself to the world. It should be up to you. Sure, this might make things confusing for those who insist everyone pick an M or an F. But people, we have to listen to the science. And the science says we're all on a spectrum. Our labels, our fashion, even our washrooms are still catching up to that truth. I think you'll find when we look at sexuality this way, it is more complicated, but it's also a lot more honest. And it's more interesting. I learned a lot tonight. I mean, I'm this cis male guy who's been living in this world. But this stuff, to me, from a scientific standpoint, is just cool. Science is the process by which we understand nature, by which we understand our place in the world, how we all fit in. And so every one of these insights is just so exciting for me. We, working together, can, dare I say it, save the world.
Now, let's get into this week's episode. If you didn't already know, the Methodist Church recently announced the ban on LGBTQ marriages and LGBTQ clergy wouldn't be formally recognized or accepted by the United Methodist Church. Delegates from around the world voted 438 to 384 to maintain the traditional plan, which maintains the church's rules. While this announcement isn't particularly a shock to me because the church overall, for the most part, has maintained its stance regarding LGBTQ issues and still remains persistent on accepting LGBTQ people, but only to the extent in which they're comfortable with. Of course, this isn't all churches and all members of all churches, but it's an overwhelming amount. And those that choose to be silent on this issue are the most impactful because not saying anything is actually saying something. With that, on this episode, I have chosen to focus on LGBTQ rights. I also want to point out that while I don't identify as LGBTQ, many of my friends do. And I do believe that in order to be an effective ally, seeking their opinions, because they're the ones affected by the most by different laws and decisions, is the right thing to do. Everyone has a story to tell, and it's not any one person's job to tell it. One of my dearest girlfriends, Yazmarr, shed some insight on her thoughts concerning the evolution of rights for the LGBTQ community. If you don't know her, Yaz is a senior at UGA. She's gay, Black, and Mexican, and one of the wisest people that I know. For her, growing up in the South as a lesbian woman of color has been fine because of her supportive friends and family. She's been in awkward situations for those that don't know her or know that she's gay, and then made some fucked up homophobic comment, which then she has to address because she's gay. Is it her job to have to always address these people? No. However, our society has become so heteronormative that it's ingrained in our minds to assume that everyone around us is straight. But that's not the case at all. She also finds it interesting that queerness in the South means people have less issues with being gay than deviations from traditional gender roles, especially with men. She isn't saying that people aren't straight up bigoted, but people don't actually want to confront some of the real issues they actually have. Dating for Yaz has been a culminating event of people not being as out as her, with the exception of one relationship that just was lovely, but not right in the end. In her opinion, the lack of acceptance stems from a larger issue of women not having dealt with their emotions in a real way, because that's a hard thing to do. The other thing she sees in regards to this is that women can be very clear about what they want, but will admit that ultimately they'll be with a man because that's just easier. In terms of the dominant culture, in this case, being straight, cisgendered people, she believes that straight people can be a mess with emotional intimacy, especially in relation to gender roles, and I wholeheartedly agree with her on that. Obviously, there's some exceptions, but she does point out that dudes need to cry and not use women as emotional punching bags, and women need to stop feeling obligated to filling that role. Period. As far as the United Methodist Church decision goes, Yaz is not religious, but was raised Catholic. The lack of acceptance is disheartening in her opinion, but ultimately, she wants acceptance from her Creator because she does no wrong and has brought love in her life that is given to her by a woman. Lastly, as being gay is becoming more accepted, Yaz has noticed that the community is starting to lose allyship from a lot of white queer people, especially men. There are certain people that can only be LGBTQ and fight for those rights only when it affects them, which is why intersectionality is so important. Now we're just seeing who's really down with the shit and who is just down for themselves, according to Yaz. Supporting queer people, especially queer people of color, and especially trans women of color, needs to be a focal point in our activism and action. Like I said, if you don't know Yazmarr, I would highly encourage you to become friends with her, meet with her, because she is incredibly wise, so funny, and just adds such a really good perspective to any conversation that she's having with whomever. I love her, and I'm so grateful that she was willing to share her thoughts with me. The LGBTQ community has seen some progression recently in terms of same-sex marriage finally being legalized in all 50 states, as well as adoption. But we still have so far to go in terms of ensuring every person within this community is treated equitably and with dignity.
Recent history has brought incredible progress for the LGBTQ community. Things get tricky.
So does becoming a business owner mean you have to check your convictions at the door?
Right now, the state of Michigan does not include sexual orientation and gender identity in its law.
I'm just really nervous.
What do I owe this honor?
I actually have something important to talk to you about.
The fact is, in most states, it's still currently legal to fire LGBTQ people, kick them out of a store or business that serves the public, or even evict them from housing because of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
The ayes are 49, the noes are 50. The bill is not agreed to.
Often, it's as subtle as a boss picking another job application, or a landlord denying rent without explanation. These are the rights protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
My fellow Americans, those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secure only if each generation thought to renew and enlarge its meaning.
Following the passage of the Civil Rights Act, federal and state laws prohibited this type of discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. This is called enumeration. If you list the characteristics that are most often the subject of discrimination, it removes any doubt that these people are protected.
Since these early days, I have seen and I have experienced many other types of discrimination, and all of them were rooted in the fear of people that were different than the majority.
But sexual orientation and gender identity are not enumerated in most states, and a report by the Human Rights Campaign found that lawmakers in 29 states have actually proposed bills that would actively discriminate against LGBTQ people.
We have what's called a patchwork of civil rights protections on this issue in this country.
Sam Brownback, the governor of Kansas, went so far as to write an executive order to reverse a measure that barred employment discrimination against LGBTQ people. On top of all of this, there's systematic discrimination across many schools throughout the country.
Ellen DeGeneres has been speaking out, voicing her outrage about the cruelty that spiraled out of control in our schools and beyond.
Today is October 20th, 2013. Hopefully today will be a big day of my life in a positive way.
The states in red here have no promo homo laws that forbid teachers in public schools from even mentioning homosexuality at all.
If you are reading this, it means that I have committed suicide. Those words written on a Warren County teenager's Tumblr page, and now sparking an outcry from the LGBT community tonight.
That's where coming out videos on YouTube like Drew's and Adam's are so helpful.
So I have something serious I wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah, I like guys.
I have to tell you that I'm gay.
Okay.
Always have been, always will be.
And you know how I drew that in 7th grade, and how in 7th grade I wanted to kill myself? It's been something that I've not liked for a while, especially when people called me fag a lot.
There are too many kids out there suffering from bullying, rejection, or simply being mistreated because of who they are.
And there's proof that enumeration works. GLSEN, an organization that advocates for LGBTQ students, says students who go to schools with enumerated LGBTQ policies experience significantly lower severities of bullying.
Federal investigators are looking into accusations that Minnesota's largest school district discriminates against gay students following 7 student suicides in fewer than 2 years.
These are laws that save lives. 2012 was the first year in U.S. history where more people supported same-sex marriage than people who didn't.
I know I'm kind of destroying every hope and dream you ever had for me.
No, not at all.
2015 will be remembered for marriage equality. Public figures have been more open discussing their own sexuality, and popular TV shows have begun to incorporate more LGBTQ characters in the stories they tell. It's clear that the LGBTQ civil rights battles are far from over.
In 1952, being gay was literally listed as a sociopathic personality disorder. A year later, President Eisenhower signed an executive order saying that gay people working in the federal government was a security risk. It wasn't until almost 20 years later that queerness was taken off of the list of mental disorders. Then, President Clinton signed into law Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which prohibited openly gay and lesbian Americans from serving in the military. Some could argue that this measure protects closeted military members because of the language used, which is true. But to what extent? Is it worth disallowing people to lead authentic, choice-filled lives in order to satisfy the needs of few? I don't think so. Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed. Same-sex couples now have the legal right to marry, which is great. However, in the age of Trump and Pence, the progression for LGBTQ members to exist is being halted with new policies and laws being implemented. The Supreme Court recently allowed Trump's ban on transgender individuals to serve in the military to go into effect. Wow. The federal government did make it unconstitutional for same-sex couples to be denied the right to adopt by a state agency. Some states have enforced restrictions and laws against couples of the same sex that are trying to adopt on the basis of religious freedom. So, you mean to tell me that some agencies would prefer to keep a child in the system and away from a loving home on the basis that they'll have the same gender parent? That shit does not make sense to me at all. Despite the fact that LGBTQ couples typically make more money than heterosexual couples and stay together longer than heterosexual couples, there are still institutions willing to keep these people from adopting children. There's also still no federal law surrounding workplace discrimination for LGBTQ people. Yes, some states have enacted anti-discriminatory policies, but it's still very much legal to fire someone based on sexual identity or gender identity. The lack of gender-neutral restrooms in a public space is a huge problem as well. Conversion therapy has to go because it's inhumane, disgusting, and a gross abuse of power and manipulation. And it doesn't work, Mike Pence. He's such a dumbass. Anyways, housing discrimination, accessibility in sports, business, politics, and violence, lifting the ban on gay blood, and much more are some of the few facets in the lives of these people that are grossly limited. To be straight and cisgender means to be surrounded by endless privileges that a community in the same spaces we exist in are not privileged enough to have. It's in the dominant culture's hands to learn how to be effective allies that do not stifle the progression for LGBTQ rights, but helps to move them forward. Sexuality has and will always be a fluid process. We now know through psychology that human minds have varying degrees of sexual plasticity. Lesbians, gays, transgenders, bisexuals, and other members of this community have been on this planet forever. It is only recently that large numbers have the courage to live open and fulfilling lives against dominant heteronormative culture. Sexuality exists on a spectrum, and you can literally have desire for whoever you want. You should not be ashamed of it or try to repress it because it is a beautiful part of the human experience. This also extends to those who identify with an opposite gender identity than assigned at birth. We also have masculine and feminine sides to us, and we express those sides differently. And it is okay to go against the grain to express your own desires and sense of self. It's going to take some time for this to progress in specific regions, like Yazmarr touched on for the South. But I want to call on each and every listener out there right now to commit yourselves to being an ally for this beautiful community. Let's spread this love far and wide so that maybe one day queerness doesn't have to remain queer, but a normal and beautiful part of being human. I hope this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listened and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that recognizing homophobia and transphobia as a persisting problem in our country that leaves groups of people in this country more likely to be impoverished, jobless, and killed encourages collective action that works to dismantle our biases against LGBTQ people. People should have the opportunity to lead dignified lives in public, no matter who they love. Love is love and should be recognized by all as that. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Lenico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French,